Welcome back, everyone. We are starting our second session, which will be operated by David Levin. He's experienced in the field of electoral integrity and security, with particular interest in the challenges of fair democracies. His work has been featured in notable publications such as The Hill, BBC, USA Today, Business Insider, and many more. He is an adjunct professor at the George Mason University and a member of the Election Verification Network, co-authored the report Building Resilience Against Election Influence Operations, preparing for the European elections in 2024 and beyond, together with Daria and Nicoletta, who is with us online, as well as his former German Marshall Fund colleague, Crisia Sikora. David, please.
Thank you, Magnus. It's a real honor to be here, and it's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces. The first panel was sterling, quite frankly, and certainly set the bar high. But I'm hopeful that we will meet, if not exceed that, here with the second panel as well. But Magnus, thanks for those remarks. And before I get into the panel, I just want to take an opportunity to do brief intros for the three panelists that we have here. You can obviously look at the materials and go online to find more extensive remarks. But as many of you know, of course, to my immediate right is Daria, right, Azarov North, and she, of course, is the senior program manager for Europe and Eurasia at IFES headquarters in Washington, and was one of, along with Nikki, authors on that paper that Magnus just alluded to, that we'll be talking a little more about later on in the session. And both she and Nikki were terrific partners on that effort. Daria oversees the program design and implementation of a broad portfolio in the region with electoral stakeholders in the Western Balkans, the Eastern Partnership, and Visegrad 4 countries to build capacity in responding to persistent and emerging challenges in democratic resilience. And as many of you know, she provides thought leadership on a whole host of efforts relating to countering disinformation, as well as malign foreign interference and influence efforts. To my immediate right, or to her immediate right, sorry about that, is Emma. And Emma is the Senior Administrative Officer for Election Security and Election Integrity at the Swedish Election Authority. The reason that I did not attempt to provide her last name is that admittedly I didn't want to butcher it so badly that would be sort of disrespectful to everyone here. But for those of you that are not familiar with them, and I would think that's few of you, she plays an intimate role, an important role with the Swedish Election Authority. I know I have, and I know others have heard her as well, explain to journalists and others how Swedish elections are run and changes to election law. She also dispels common misunderstandings about election processes and trains others on how the election process works to promote public understanding of Sweden's elections. And that, I think, sort of stems from sort of her background in terms of working with human rights organizations. And of course, she's got a degree in political science and psychology. The next person that I want to introduce, who's with us virtually. Oh, okay. Well, sorry about that. Nikki Diassi, who's a senior program officer for IFES's Regional Europe office in Prague. She also, of course, was one of the co-authors on the report that Daria, I, and my former colleague Crisia worked on. In this role, as a senior program officer at IFES, she regularly engages with stakeholders across Central and Eastern Europe, the Western Balkans, and the Baltics to foster resilient democracies and promote electoral integrity and inclusivity. And her areas of specialization include combating foreign interference in election processes and advocating for gender equality within democratic frameworks. And then finally, the panelist all the way to my right, to most folks' left, is Dmitry Bilash, who's a tech entrepreneur and investor focused on building breakthrough products. He's a co-founder of Savul, a software company providing AI-based solutions for information security and countering disinformation, and managing partner for the VC capital fund Digital Future. He was also a co-founder of Capital Growth, an AI-based marketing automated platform that was subsequently acquired by Parian. One of the things that I want folks to sort of be paying close attention to here, it was something that Daria and others touched on, is how we go about sort of countering authoritarian and autocratic influence operations. And not only sort of thinking about sort of, again, playing defense, but what we're sort of doing offensively. You're going to hear conversations not only about how bad actors are trying to use emerging and evolving technologies like AI, but you'll also be hearing from folks about potentially how to try and use AI for good, including on the front lines. Before I get into the comments from my panelists, and again, this session is going to be more like small vignettes or small presentations as opposed to sort of the back and forth Q&A we saw in the last one. I just want to sort of touch on a little bit of that paper that myself, Daria, Nikki, and Krisha wrote. I'll just take a couple minutes to sort of touch on that paper. And the reason I want to touch on it, aside from, oh, it's nice to talk about a paper that you co-wrote, which I suppose is always good too, is that I think that it helps sort of set the stage for this panel and sort of the broader day. And so just to sort of, I think touch on that a little bit, this paper was written admittedly before the EU parliamentary election, so it's not going to have that piece of it. But I think, one of the things that I think was really important when this paper was written last spring was that we saw countries, not only in Europe, but across the world, that were confronting election influence operations. Right? Covert or overt efforts by foreign and domestic actors to circulate false, misleading, or harmful information to try and adversely impact an election. We know, for example, that, ahead of the EU parliamentary elections, of course, in June, we know that the EU Special Committee on Foreign Interference warned that foreign interference and disinformation, particularly by the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and others, were likely to continue in ever greater numbers and become more sophisticated. And while we can't necessarily sort of measure the impact, and that's been something that's been talked about here, we do know that this is likely to be something that continues to be a problem. And in fact, as someone who's based obviously across the pond, we do know that there's been some reporting ahead of the 2024 US presidential elections that the PRC, for example, is experimenting with AI tools to try and conduct campaigns that exploit cleavages and amplify divisions in the US. And frankly, as we've touched on already, these sorts of actions have the ability to sow chaos and erode trust in democratic systems across the world. And as the first panelist touched on, right, different countries have varying abilities to be able to address these kinds of challenges. And so, this paper not only touches on that, but talks about the challenges that are compounded, frankly, by some other factors as well. And that includes social media's companies' struggles, right? Many of those companies' struggles to protect their platforms from information threats, as has been widely publicized, and many of you have written about, right? Many social media companies have rolled back, right, some of their most useful measures to uphold election integrity online. I think it was Armin that was talking last night to me about this, but many of you know about this too. The recent, right, pullback with regards to CrowdTangle. We know that we've seen disabling functions to report false election information, the dissolution of election integrity teams in some cases, and the overhauling of account verification services. And, something that Daria has touched on as well, and we'll probably keep coming back to, is that as malign actors increasingly coordinate and learn from one another's election influence operations, democratic actors need to do the same, quite frankly. And so, this paper really was about countries learning from one another best practices for countering influence operations so they could bolster their own operations. And so this report, in a real nutshell, which Dario and Nikki will be touching on in a bit more detail, offers up examples of best practices for building resilience against election influence operations that have been adopted by 5 European countries, 3 of which we'll get to in more detail. The ones that will less detail are going to be France and Estonia, but we'll be touching in a bit more detail about Sweden, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Ukraine. And for each of these case studies, the paper examines how those best practices have bolstered the country's resilience against election information manipulation. Each case study, just real quickly, was followed by broad guidance to help other countries adopt some or all of these practices, right, into their context, with, of course, the caveat that no 2 countries are the same. And just to sort of be clear, right, we understand, of course, that, no 2 countries are the same. And this paper was not directed at any one particular country. We're not trying to, We're not trying to sort of target any one country here. It was frankly written with an eye towards how countries could continuously, right, bolster their election information defenses in both the short and the long term. I know that when we wrote this paper, there was a lot of talk and conversation when I spoke with reporters and others about what's going to happen to do these things immediately ahead of the European parliamentary election. And frankly, this paper was written several weeks beforehand, so the answer was not a lot in many cases, right? But frankly, we view this as something, as a product that could be helpful not only in the months, but years to come. And so many countries, including the vast majority of those in Europe, just really important to note, are increasingly recognizing the importance of bolstering their resilience to information manipulation and safeguarding election integrity. Again, Arm and others touched on that, whether it's through the Digital Services Act or other things. So what this paper is, again, is offering our ideas for how countries in upcoming elections can make continual improvements leading up to even on, right, election day. With that, we're going to have a lot less talking from me and more from my panel. So I'm going to turn it over to Daria to talk through a little more information about a couple of our case studies. Daria?
Excellent. Thank you, David, for that great introduction and overview of our paper. Before I go into the two case studies that I'll be touching on, I want to go back to this idea that several of us have touched on in terms of there being no silver bullet, no one size fits all, and no established framework. And so that's really where the concept of this paper came from, is we decided to look at, okay, let's look at countries that have this figured out to some extent. Let's look at different pieces of the puzzle and see, what can we learn? What can we glean? And again, what can we learn from each other? So as David mentioned, we looked at a total of 5 countries, France, Estonia, Sweden, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Ukraine. And I think it's interesting to note because 2 of those countries, as you know, are not part of the EU, but are working very hard to be. So, we'll get to a lot of that further in detail. So the first case study that I want to talk about is Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's an interesting example because, again, it's not an EU country, and I think that comes with a lot of important aspects to it, touching also on what we talked about with Alban in terms of the way that several Western Balkan countries are a direct target of both domestic and foreign interference efforts, especially from the Kremlin in its efforts to undermine, discredit, of course, not just democratic processes, but democratic and Western institutions like the EU and NATO. And so Bosnia, as I'm sure most of you know, faces a very complex political landscape and history. And so when we looked at the 2022 elections, also just for context, we focused the paper on elections that took place since the 2019 European Parliament elections as a case study to see what has changed and what has evolved since then in advance of the 2024 elections. So for Bosnia, we looked at the 2022 general elections and parliamentary elections. And so the election environment for that was just filled to the brim with ethnic tensions, external geopolitical interests, a lot of divisive rhetoric from politicians, and also a failure to agree on electoral reforms, which made the country extremely vulnerable to disinformation narratives on several fronts, including malign influence, both from domestic and foreign actors. And we saw a lot of efforts from Russia, from China, and then, of course, domestically. And so the Central Election Commission actually, in a conversation to us, had described this period as the most turbulent so far, with the integrity of the CEC itself actually also under attack through various narratives. And actually going back to what we talked about with Ingrid earlier, there was also a significant component of gender-based narratives as well. So to counter these threats, the Central Election Commission decided to be proactive and build their capacity by implementing a crisis communications and combating disinformation playbook, which IFES helped develop in partnership with the Brunswick Group. And actually the story behind the playbook, for those of you who don't know, is interesting because I think it really speaks to the heart of what we do at IFES and our Regional Europe office here in Prague. And so We have several members from this working group here today, but essentially in 2020, we established a working group for election management bodies from the region, specifically focusing on social media, electoral integrity, and disinformation, looking at how could we help them tackle these challenges and fill the gaps. And so one of the kind of poignant, very obvious gaps that immediately emerged in 2020 once we started talking to EMBs about this challenge was that there was no guide for EMBs in terms of how to tackle or respond to disinformation, where to even begin. And so in short, this playbook, and we can also share it as a resource for those who are interested, compiles several different best practices in terms of establishing an internal rapid response team, really focusing in on this principle of building resilience in advance and being proactive. And so another key element of that is actually going back to something Susanna mentioned, is conducting vulnerability assessments and anticipating high-risk narratives, but also using early warning tools to the extent possible and engaging with other stakeholders that can serve as validators. Finally, also a big piece of that is actually social media presence. So election management bodies, like other organizations, actually have a brand to maintain. That brand is very important because it's about maintaining public trust and it's about having credibility. And so a big thing that we talk about during that working group and in the playbook is that the first time that your audience hears from you cannot be during a time of crisis. It's actually critical that you have that relationship established throughout the electoral cycle so that when there is a high-risk narrative and you need to respond, you already have that credibility established. So following a training on the playbook, the CEC did conduct that vulnerability assessment and try to implement several of those practices as part of the playbook. There's also significant scenario planning components as part of that. And ultimately, of course, there were still quite significant challenges and obviously a broad range of disinformation narratives that took place during that election. However, the CEC's efforts did pay off ultimately. There were several false narratives that the CEC was able to mitigate and nip in the butt before the election, thanks to those actions. And their efforts were recognized by international organizations like the OSCE. So really, to summarize, the key lessons that we can glean for other election management bodies, but also other public institutions, government institutions from the Bosnia-Herzegovina case study is really comes down to the importance of preparation in advance, identifying target audiences for your messaging, anticipating high-risk narratives, conducting vulnerability assessments, and developing communication plans that can help build public trust. And really, those are critical elements that any institution can tailor and adapt to some extent.
Dara,
So,
did you have more?
so that's the Bosnia case study. And then very briefly, before handing over to Emma, which I'm so excited that we have a representative from the SEA and Sweden here, because one of the main reasons that we had a Swedish case study is because Sweden, in many ways, has really become a global leader when it comes to developing best practices to counter election influence operations. So for Sweden, the country really started to focus on these efforts in 2018 after witnessing the impact that Russian interference had in the US elections in 2016 and other European elections. And rather than just attempting to halt the spread of disinformation, Sweden decided to adopt a whole of society approach, which we've already talked about a bit, to build the resilience of its institutions, but also its society and its ability to withstand influence activities. So in short, in 2018, Sweden started this by training and providing educational tools on foreign influence threats to more than 14,000 of its civil servants and election officials, and that was highly successful. And then Sweden doubled down on this whole of society approach and its efforts in preparation for the 2022 general election by launching the Psychological Defense Agency, otherwise known as MPF, And that actually built on previous efforts of the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. And very similar to France's Viginum unit, which we talk about in the French case study, the Psychological Defense Agency leads Sweden's monitoring of foreign influence operations, but it also has a second equally important role, and that's to direct education initiatives that are intended to strengthen society's overall resilience to information manipulation. So ahead of the 2022 election, Sweden faced an increase. Thank you, Kati. Sweden faced an increase in terms of the risk and anticipation of potential interference from Russia, particularly because of its bid to join NATO. And to help counter those potential harmful narratives, the agency launched a campaign called Don't Be Fooled. That circulated several educational videos, one-pagers, and also provided free online courses to teach citizens how to better navigate that online environment and raise awareness. So also goes back to this concept of looking at society holistically, not just public institutions, but building up civic education, media literacy, and awareness of voters. And they also published a guidebook to help journalists better learn how to identify and respond to false information, and briefed political parties about foreign information threats. So truly a multifaceted and integrated approach. And so ultimately, Sweden actually did not end up experiencing the degree of foreign influence that was anticipated. That's probably hard to know, going back to our conversation earlier in terms of, is that because it didn't happen, or is that because they were well prepared? But I think it is reasonable to say that a lot of these proactive steps did contribute to the country's high voter turnout and society's overall satisfaction with its democratic institution. And this whole of society approach, I think, is truly transferable to other countries in many ways. And so with that, I'm very excited for Emma to further build on that from the SEA perspective. Not to take over David's role.
No, Daria, I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure there was enough time for the Sweden lead up to Emma. Emma, I want to turn it over to you to sort of expound a bit more right on Daria was talking about in terms of sort of Sweden's work.
Thank you. Let's see. I have some slides. Yes. So while we're waiting for the slides, my last name is Sjöblom, which David and I were practicing on pronouncing before, but as I was telling him, I know it's really difficult. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to give you a short review of our focuses in 2024. Thank you, Daria, for the perfect introduction to the Swedish whole of society, how we work in Sweden. But I'm gonna just touch upon firstly what Daria was already mentioning, the strengths of the Swedish system, which is we try, and we usually talk about it as a robust system because it's decentralized. We have a 2-vote count, to count the votes twice. We also have a principle of public access, which means that you can access both the voting and also the counter vote. So everyone is allowed to observe all of the process. We also have a very high trust within the public in Sweden. So both the election authority where I work and the election system has a very, very high trust. In surveys that we do annually in Sweden, we are the second highest after the Coastal Guard. And we also have this very long traditional high turnout. So we have something to safeguard in Sweden, which is trust and this high turnout. And the high turnout, I would just want to add that we actually have an automatic enrollment in the election roll. So it's automatic registration. So it's you don't even have to apply to be on the election roll. So when we talk in Sweden about election security, what we talk about that we want to protect is the will and the ability to vote and the whole electoral process, and what I was already touching about, the trust in the electoral process. So we talk about election security as being the whole panorama, from the physical threats to the cyber attacks and disinformation. So we talk about everything when we talk about election security. Well, and now the focuses areas in 2024. We focused on cooperation between public authorities. We also focused on providing training and materials and tools for the local and regional authorities. And we also focused on incident reporting. And I'm going to go through these briefly, all of these three focus areas. So we have in Sweden a national election cooperation network that is headed by us, the election authority, and all the other members are the Swedish police, the security service, the civil contingency agency, the psychological defense agency that Darius was mentioning, and also the county administrative boards. So this election cooperation network was formally founded in the autumn of 2021, but it existed before that, even from, I think, 2018. And the network has a strategic cooperation. The focus is strategic cooperation. In this year election, we had two working groups that were active. One working group on cyber security and one working group on communication. So this networks meet all year round, even between the elections, but when we have an election coming up, they meet much more frequently. So between elections, we have meetings, we have tabletop exercises, but during the election period, we have almost daily check-ins, we exchange information. The election cooperation network also give input on our dimensioning threat assessment that we produce before each election in Sweden. Then we have the other pillar of our this year's election, which was the sharing of knowledge and tools and also trainings to the local and regional authorities. We share this on a specific website, which we call the Election Center. So here, all the local and regional authorities can find guidelines, manuals, tutorials, that they also find this dimensioning threat assessment that we urge them to use this to do their own local threat assessment. We also provide digital trainings, and before this election, we also did in-person trainings. So scenario-based tabletops exercises. We traveled the whole country to meet the local and regional authorities to discuss all kinds of threats, ranging from physical threats to disinformation campaigns. We even had one AI example. This was very much appreciated by the local and regional authorities. We also do digital broadcasts on topics that we find interesting for the local and regional authorities to learn more about. So we already talked a little bit or a lot about the Swedish way of preventing interference with our elections. So, but in short, what we recommend is to identify the threats, to do assessments, and do, the steps to protect beforehand, what we can do. Then to detect what is happening, to monitor the information environment. And then, of course, respond or act in a timely manner. This year, we stressed a lot the local regional authorities to strive for zero administrative errors, because we were afraid of, or we were afraid that these could be used in a misinformation campaign. If there was a small error, it could be used to blown up in a bigger proportion. So that was something that this message was sent out to the local and regional authorities. We also, of course, then also we asked them to report incidents to us at the central level, to the election authority, which takes me to the last pillar of the focus of 2024, which is incident reporting. I got a question before here when we had coffee. What is one of the biggest challenges in Sweden. And I was thinking about it afterwards, and it's like one of the big challenges are that we don't always have the legislation with us. It's lacking behind. So, for example, when it comes to incident reporting, we have a system now in Sweden. We ask the local and regional authorities to report incidents to us, but this is completely voluntary for them to do at the moment. So we're waiting for a change in law, but a lot of them are doing it, but since it's voluntary, they are not, of course, not all of them are not doing it. They don't have the funds to be able to report because it takes time as well. But we tell them that we want reports on all kinds of actually incidents, which could be something that damage or risk to damage the election process or the trust in the election process. So it could be everything from nature event to system errors to administrative errors or any malicious human action. This year, we created an online form to make it even easier for them to report this to us. And the reported incidents that we got from the local and regional authorities, they were 927 incidents. As you can see, the majority happened or occurred during the early voting period, which starts in Sweden 18 days before the election day. But they didn't report it in real time, most of the incidents. And that's a big challenge for us because we want the reports straight ahead. I also want to stress that they can always call us. So we have this reporting online form, but they can always call us 24/7. But this is what the statistic is, well, what we have gotten in written. So the reporting time is a bit of a delay. The vast majority is after election day. Well, and then what kind of incidents did they report? We have a complex system in Sweden with a lot of ballot papers. Those of you who know the Swedish system understands why we got a ballot paper related incident. That was 70% of them. So it's stolen, they are hidden, they are some way manipulated. We had some in the category of others. We had some locks that didn't open. We had fire alarms that went off, small administrative errors, etc. We also had very few reports on disinformation. I think there were like 2 reports. This is not the whole picture. I really want to stress this. We had a lot of big cities or municipalities that didn't report incidents at all. So this is not the full picture, but we're trying to get there. And why do we want these incident reports? We, of course, want to have the picture of what's happening in Sweden during election time. And we also want to share the information with the local and regional authorities to help them in their work with managing the threats and to respond to. So we want to give them the picture or a snapshot of what's actually happening. And our idea in the future is that we want to give them a real-time snapshot of what's happening. But we create this written snapshot or situational awareness picture. We include the incidents that we have got reports on. We include what we have found in traditional social media that might be relevant. We also include information from these national authorities that they want to share, those who are in the network. And we publish this. So on that with a few times per week now in 2024 or on a daily basis when we have national elections. So we publish them on this election center, or we publish them, I think it says on the WIS, which is internet-based information sharing system that we use in Sweden when entities in the emergency, the Swedish emergency management, when they want to share information between each other. Well, and as Daria said already, we didn't, the Swedish Defense Agency, they said after the elections, they couldn't find or see any coordinated foreign influence campaign towards Sweden.
Emma, I really appreciate that. I think, one of the things that's, I think, unique and interesting about this panel is that, And the examples that we've got are, I think Sweden, many of you know, is sort of, I think, a real leader in dealing with some of the issues that we're dealing with today. And we're also, for the paper, we were trying to find, frankly, right, have a heterogeneous, right, set of case studies. So EU, non-EU, countries that have perhaps had a longer history of dealing with this. And frankly, I think one of the other things that I think is interesting about both the paper as well as this panel, we've now talked about 2 case studies where we've talked about actions that were taken right ahead of an election. The next example that we're going to talk about is obviously about a country that I think is hoping, right, obviously at some point to be able to conduct elections, but isn't able to currently do so for reasons that are, of course, patently obvious, right, to everybody in this room in terms of Ukraine. So, now, Emma, I appreciate the points you're making, and I've got a whole bunch of questions I want to get to, but I also know in the interest of time, I want to move over to our next presenter. Nikki, if I know you're here with us, if you wouldn't mind, right, kicking us off and giving us a bit about the Ukraine case study example, and then that, of course, will segue into Dimitro's conversation as well.
Thank you so much, David. I hope you can hear me. Good late morning to everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you for having me on this panel, at least virtually. As I'm juggling a little bit of a technical side online, just give me 30 seconds until I share screen. And please, David, let me know if you can see everything and hear everything. Okay, I think you should be able to see now my presentation. All right, so I will be providing just a quick glance into the case study, Ukraine case study that we featured in our paper. So since the 2013 Revolution of Dignity and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine has been engaged in both a kinetic conflict as well as the information war. The Ukraine's decade-long battle against Kremlin interference provides a crucial insights into defending the electoral information environment. A key component of Ukraine's success is a robust cross-sectoral coordination involving stakeholders from civil society, government institution, media, academia, as well as the private sector, while harvesting emerging technologies like AI and machine learning. Leading up to the 2020 local elections, Ukraine faced a surge in Russian disinformation aimed at destabilizing the country. The Kremlin's tactics included spreading fear about COVID-19 pandemic and undermining Ukraine's state legitimacy. However, Ukraine's preparedness and cooperation across sectors effectively countered these narratives. Here on the second slide, you can see the stakeholders from various sectors. Worth mentioning is Detector Media and Stop Fake, which played a really pivotal role in debunking false claims, enhancing media literacy before and during the local elections in 2020, and they are still debunking false narratives till today. Another great initiative from the civil sector is the Help SMI e-platform, which connects journalists with experts across various fields, promoting freedom of speech and countering malign narratives. This platform has exposed corruption and debunked false narratives, contributing to the integrity of Ukraine's electoral processes. From the government sector, the Center for Countering Disinformation is worthwhile mentioning, which debunks manipulative narratives and cooperates with civil society, such as Stop Fake. The Center for Strategic Communication also focuses on joint efforts with civil society to combat disinformation. They have created a debunking page, Spravdy, that has been instrumental in providing verified information, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And from the private sector, we have representatives such as Osavul and Mentis Analytics that are using the AI and emerging technologies to counter disinformation. They employ technology to detect and counter online harmful narratives swiftly and cooperate mainly with the Ukrainian government, but also other parts of the society. I will, of course, not go into detail here, as we will hear from the co-founder and representative of Osavul that is with you in the room, Dmitro. And I'm really looking forward for his comments on cross-sectoral cooperation and the use of new technologies. So just to sum up, the Ukrainian case study that we featured in the paper is showing us that this collaboration between government, private sector, and civil society really strengthens Ukrainians' defense against disinformation, even amidst the challenges posed by the 2022 invasion by Russia, and should serve as a lesson learned for other countries that want to better defend themselves against disinformation and maintain democratic resilience. Thank you so much.
Nikki, thanks so much for those comments and remarks and that excellent summary of the Ukraine case study. I want to kick it now over to Dmitro. If you wouldn't mind, I think me and as well as many others in the room are interested in hearing more about your company, and as well as some of the efforts that you've had in terms of trying to sort of counter influence operations. And I know while some folks have sort of been hinting at the sort of making positive uses of AI, we haven't necessarily perhaps delved into that in real significant ways, and perhaps this presents that opportunity as well.
Thank you for the opportunity for being here. It's an absolute pleasure. Today we talked a lot about how AI can be a threat, and it actually is. So each time a new model appears, and actually it happened today, OpenAI released a new model that is crazy. I checked it in the morning, and it's even more powerful than before. So every few weeks we experience a new growth of AI capabilities, and as a result of AI threats. But in Osavul, we are very much sure that AI can be also used for good. Especially in our process. And you kind of have the same quality of knife and shield. So if you are attacked with AI, you need to be protected with AI. And this is the philosophy that we bring on the table. And today I wanted to quickly explain to you how, from our perspective, AI for good should work, and especially in the context of electoral process, but not only, even broader in the governmental affairs. So short intro about our company, because some of you may see our first time. So Osavul was a tech company founded by Ukrainians and a Ukrainian team, but right now we work globally. We have employees in EU, in the US. We work a lot with Ukrainian government. Here is just one logo, but overall we cooperate with more than 20 government institutions, both civil, military, and security, but also work with EU fund projects, NATO, and many, many other states all over the world. And as we develop different technologies today, I'm gonna share with you what we've built or what we are thinking should be built in a future. And today I will talk about 3 pillars on which AI can be applied. So the first pillar is situational awareness. Essentially, to be able to take any actions, we need to know what's happening. And it's becoming more and more challenging because there is a variety of social media platforms. And we are accustomed to saying, oh, there is a lot of data and so on. But just yesterday I saw news that from 2020 till 2024, amount of data transmitted by carriers, by your mobile phones, tripled. It means that 3 times more information is shared between us, and it's happening, on an enormous scale. It means that more and more data is shared between voters, and if you don't know what is happening between voters in an open web, you will never be able to understand what kind of threats you have. So situational awareness is number 1. Second, once you know what's happening, you want to extract threats out of it, right? So you want to understand which narratives are harmful, where is the disinformation, where is the opinioning of certain narratives, and where is the FIMI, foreign information malicious interference, and who is doing this. So this is the second step. And obviously then if you reveal the threat, you have the whole legal component of taking any actions around it, right? So you have this groups, as our colleague from Sweden shared, which is amazing when you can have, a coordination center, because lucky we are in the electoral process, we do have a right to take legal actions against those who interfere in this process, which is not the case for many, many other parts of a governmental activity, by the way. And the last but not least is a strand exchange and cooperation. Today, the best case scenario, if let's say Sweden revealed a disinformation campaign and they want to share it with everybody else, what do? We meet, we share, we write a report, we do trainings, but it's anyway limited to a very small amount of people. You cannot reach everybody. You cannot make everybody to look on your website, right? And then at the end of the day, amount of information just, flooded. So we need to have a more robust ways to collect threat information for information threats. In the same way as cybersecurity professionals do for cyber threats. So this is 3 pillars: situational awareness, detecting threats, and threat exchange are the key. I will give just a quick sneak peek on each one. So that's what we do for the situational awareness, for example. We have an AI that can read all the content about a certain event. It could be election, it could be, like something done by Russia, it could be the whole part of information environment in your country. And instead of you, AI read tons of content. In election process, it could be millions of posts each month, video, audio, big media, small bloggers, ordinary people, chats, communities, whatever. And then the AI is capable of extracting key opinions and key narratives from it. So at the end of the day, the analysts who look on this, maybe in an electoral commission, in IFES, in government, or in any other institution, could really understand what happened. So the millions of messages is kind of shrinked to the key narratives and key ideas that are discussed. And this is the first step to understand what's happening out there. And AI is perfect for that. Currently, we can do it easily. Like the only problem is actually cost, because it costs a lot to process so much data, and we experience this. But I think the tech industry is in a good position because AI is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So I think by the next European election, it will be much more affordable than today. The second thing is a threat detection, right? So once you reveal the narratives, you need to have an automated or maybe semi-automated process to extract threats out of it. So the way how we do this, we have an AI that looks on 3 parameters: actors, so who is spreading certain narrative. Is it a normal people? Is it a bots? Is it maybe somebody affiliated with the governments and so on? Second is a behavior. You want to see, is it a natural discussion? Or maybe it's a coordinated attack or coordinated activity. And the third is the content. Is it something related to disinformation? Does it have any kind of signs of hate speech and so on? Then AI highlights the key narrative that looks like a threat. This is how we do it in our interface. AI writes you just a quick explanation, gives some tips on what is this, is it a malign narrative, fake, and so on. And then the human analysts look in this list and filter out garbage from something that should be delivered later on, maybe to electoral commission, to the police, to the Secret Service. And then this information flows either in the reports, or even maybe other users also can have access to your interface. So we built it this way in Ukraine. We think it works well, but obviously each country might have their own approach to this. Maybe you need more meetings to share this in a security operations center. So depending on the way how you operate, you may act differently. And then once the threat is defined, you want to maybe see some details and you want to understand who is doing this. From my perspective, understanding of the sources, so from whom this threat is coming, it's extremely crucial. So you can see that this is, for example, our screenshot. Let's say there was a thread disseminated by 4,000 of accounts, but from them there was some, bots, there was some governments, there was some, verified users, and so on and so on. And by seeing this split, you can understand, okay, is it actually an attack? Or maybe people just picked up a narrative about somebody eating cats in a certain state, or is it like a coordinated campaign by state actors, or maybe by non-state actors involved into that. So this is extremely crucial. And, just by seeing on a one interface, you can understand and make a decision whether you want to escalate this as an attack or just leave it and drop it. And last but not least, it's a threat exchange and cooperation. So, by the way, we pick this idea and amplify this idea coming from our colleagues from European institutions, especially European External Action Service. So they, overall, the industry right now share the idea that we need to cooperate more, and our cooperation need to be more organized, more structured, meaning that if I'm a country A and I want to share a threat that I might be counted during my election, and just want to let everybody know how I did this. Or maybe I revealed a threat in my country about country B. So all this threat exchange should be not just in the meetings and calls and big emails, but there should be standardized files that can be updated and can be uploaded to the shared knowledge base with verified users obviously invited. There can be different levels of access. Somebody maybe only for the government, somebody on the EU level, somebody maybe on a personal level, even for fact checkers. And this information is stored there, knowing who attacked, when attacked, how, which tactics were used, and who may be responsible for that. And then if we collect it for long enough, next time when you have an election, your analysts from Electoral Commission, IFES, and so on can just open in one place and see what tactics were used 4 years ago, 2 years ago, and plan the best action now. So that's kind of the vision, how we see this. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm happy to discuss it later on. Thank you.
Dimitri, thanks so much for that that presentation. I have some questions on my end, but I know that again, we're a little pressed for time, and I'm also looking forward to what the audience has to inquire with you about. Before we turn it over to the Q&A, and thanks again for my panelists for their interesting presentations, I do want to give a couple minutes to allow the Ukraine CEC to speak. I think will that be coming in from online? Okay, we'll allow that to. Oh, from Vitaly, I apologize.
Thank you to opportunity to say some words from Ukraine and send greetings to you. Thank you that support Ukraine and help us, for our army, for our government, for our refugees in your country. But when Nicoleta say about Ukraine, a situation and about election 2020, that she not say all information, because Central Election Commission was involved to this process, to cooperation with different governments and different organizations, because we have COVID situation and we spent much time to prepare documents for people where they know correct information, because many disinformation was included to election process. And we preparing documents for people with the Ministry of Health. And it's helped for us to have correct elections, local elections. And second step is we have good educational program for our elections, and it's helped to write correct election in 2020. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate that. And not only because it fills out, right, for the audience about Ukraine's efforts in 2020, but, just as sort of a further clarification on this paper, these case studies not only were about specific countries, but also illustrated specific examples. And so in the case of Ukraine, the focus was on the leveraging that robust cross-sectoral coordination. But obviously, there were many more efforts that were involved in the 2020 local election, and that goes for the other countries' case studies as well. But I really appreciate that input. I think now we're going to turn it over to the rest of the folks here and see if there are any questions that they have for our esteemed panelists. Will I share the microphone, or is there a different one to? Oh, you got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting presentations and the interesting panel. I would have a question to Dimitro about your presentation, especially because it's something which we tried to do as well in Austria for the upcoming elections, to data scrap, VLOP data and then analyze it for disinformation and hate speech. But it seems that there's a legal uncertainty about what you can take out from the likes of Meta or Alphabet, and the Digital Services Act or the Digital Service Coordinator or the European Commission, they are not very clear on that either. So I just want to understand from you, how do you go about it, and how do you back yourself against some kind of lawsuits, for example? Thanks.
It's a very good question, and I think it's actually one of the key blind spots, because there is a continuous kind of conflict between big social media platforms who don't want to share the data, and government, civil society, companies who want this data to be shared. So the obvious and the easiest thing what you can do, you can get the data from places where it's possible, like Twitter, like Telegram, like websites where you don't run on the legal issues. Second, what you can do, you can try to get the data from places where it is hard to do this, but to do it in a legal way. So you can like also, even though CrowdTanker from Facebook is down, you have still one other opportunity that they offered, and like obviously like it's offered for very limited amount of organizations. But if these organizations share their findings, not the data, but the findings in the threat exchange that I mentioned, everybody else will benefit from the results of the research, which is part of their intellectual property, but not Meta's. So there is multiple ways how we can do this. I think the DSA at the end of the day should push platforms to be transparent. I think that for platforms, they also maybe to some extent are fine with that. But from what I heard from them, it's also a matter of money for them. It's expensive. I mean, to let everybody, all the electoral commissions to see the data, let's say in Austria, it costs them money, and Austria doesn't pay for this. And like, you know, they say, guys, it's a bit unfair, right? So I think we'll find a model even with, and Meta is the worst example. They are the strictest, right? With Twitter, it's much easier. There is a TikTok that I would say much more open and has much less a strict position as a Chinese company, so they are much more flexible. So long story short, yes, you have this issue, and you will have it all the time down the road. You find the data and get the data from places where you can. Then you start finding a creative ways to be on this one hand in compliance with the policies and laws, but on the other hand, to get the best for the community.
I appreciate, Armin, you're asking the question. Dimitri, you're coming back to it. I think that's touches on some really important things. And I think one of the tendencies sometimes is that we speak about these things in sort of an abstract kind of way. And we're now where the rubber hits the road in terms of sort of navigating this in a much more tangible kind of way. Apologies. It appears that I neglected to make sure that I was on my Wi-Fi. So I'm looking at online questions thanks to Daria's phone here. And it looks like I've got a question coming in online that's thanking us for the presentations and saying, and again, I'm just looking at this, reading it right off of Daria's phone. Election info integrity is often influenced by campaigns against non-election institutions months before the election, creating spins. What do you think of other state agencies' preparedness for mitigating disinfo rapidly? Is there something you think they should invest in particularly? Maybe I would be particularly interested, maybe first in putting that question to Emma, right, in terms of sort of your current role, and then maybe going there, maybe going to Daria to talk about the Bosnia example. Oh.
I'm sorry, I think you want to I can answer this.
All right.
Question. Like other institutions outside of electoral institutions. So very much of it. Sorry.
No.
Sorry, just rereading the question because of how it's framed. It's a good question. Just wrapping my head around it. Yes. I mean, I think, again, it's a good question. I think it really ties back to a lot of the elements that we've been talking about. So here, the question is about notes about how these efforts are often months in advance and the importance of preparedness, I think. So really goes back to preparing in advance and coordinating. I think that's why we were thinking maybe from the Swedish perspective in particular, as you have that electoral cooperation network. So thinking about how it's not just electoral institutions that can prepare and are the targets, although they are prominent targets, but looking at how I think that whole of society approach, how police, media, civil society, different parts of government can cooperate with electoral institutions, but also with each other. I think in particular with this panel, it's so interesting to note what the tech sector is thinking about when it comes to these solutions. Because I think, again, I really loved Susanna's point about what are we missing? And I think I really think that this is something that we can tackle, but we are not going to figure it out alone. And that's why we're all here today. So really speaks to the importance of cross-sectoral coordination. I think exchanging information, learning from each other, not reinventing the wheel, but actually taking advantage of the resources and the knowledge out there and connecting with each other and then finding best ways to leverage that. So that's in short from my perspective. I see Susanna has her hand up, so would love to hear from her.
So yeah, I could elaborate on that a bit. So in the trainings that we organize and the exercises, we always try to encourage our participant states really to have this cross-government institutions represented. So it's definitely not only the election management bodies, it's also the police, intelligence services, sometimes, for example, Ministry of Education, who are in charge of like media literacy programs or critical thinking. So it's really important that it's not only us all in circle humming the same rhythm, but actually like really trying to question the practices and procedures that the governments are working and how could they benefit from cross-institutional communication and really learning from them. But if I may just add kind of like a follow-up question on this. So I think this goes to all panelists, also the one online. So as we have noticed, unfortunately, in recent years, counter-disinformation efforts have become heavily politicized, especially across the pond in the US, but also in Europe. And this also comes down to election protection efforts. Quite often, they're actually framed as election interference, which is very unfortunate. And I would not like that trend to be more visible in the coming months and years. But is there, like, do you have any recommendations or lessons learned to depoliticize these efforts? I know that, for example, in Sweden, you have clear boundaries when it comes to like focusing only on FIMI and just like Viginum in France. So that's at least one lesson. But also like the transparency regulations are something that needs to be defined quite clearly. But is there some ideas, especially from the private sector? What do you think that what could counter disinformation efforts underminers? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start. So I fully agree with you that disinformation is not a cool word anymore. I mean, like sometimes, especially in states, when you say disinformation, some communities, you may feel awkward because like even like with fact checkers with whom we work, I remember that once they fact checked and said this is disinformation, but then it became, part of political discussion and it actually appeared in real life. And I felt first time in my life really awkward in this situation. Even though we didn't do this debunk, but it was, done through our technology. So that's why, first of all, I think we need to think in the context of information threats and what is called FIMI. When it's coming abroad, is definitely part of internal discussion. So it's fine to work with that, and it will not, impact the democratic process. Second, I think there is a wonderful approach which is called like ABC framework. When you look on actor, behavior, and content. Content, it's actually the last and the least part of this. If it's a purely straightforward facts, but they're disseminated by bots and amplified by actors that typically do the threats and coming from foreign part, even though it's a fact, they can be weaponized, right? So we need to move from the, just discussion of fake news and actions on fake news and fact checks to the actual understanding that even facts can be weaponized, and looking on the behavior and actors, and slightly move focus to theming. We'll miss obviously some internal part, but in this case, we will not stand on a road of mistrust between different, polarized communities, and nobody wants, foreign forces to intervene in your process. So in this case, you are on a safe space.
I'll just, I think, worth interjecting is both the mentioning to across the pond and as a former election official myself in the United States, one thing I think we've sort of touched on, but it's worth being more explicit, is that the efforts by some of these foreign actors, there's the Russian Federation, right, Iranian affiliate actors, China, right? Sometimes they are coming in and they're weighing in on a particular side, or they're trolling a particular party. But in many instances, and I think the COA would agree, that this is often about doing what you can to undermine democracy more generally. And in fact, just to use the example in the United States in 2020, right, there were efforts made to go after in the Republican primary certain Republicans. There were efforts to prop up, right, in the 2020 primary certain Democrats. And so, again, there are other things, but I think that, any political gains, right, folks might think they might have from this kind of thing, frankly, are often sort of short-lived and can very much sort of come back to sort of bite you. That doesn't completely get at the politicized notion, but certainly in the US and in some other places where there are folks that I think very much sort of feel like this is helpful to them in the here and now. We've seen time and time again that at least in the long term, that's not particularly helpful.
I believe Katerina had a question in the back.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bachana, Central Election Commission of Georgia. First of all, I want to thank you such an useful and interesting information. I have a question, especially for Emma. We have many ways to fight against disinformation. We conduct trainings, online courses, briefings, media literacy. We have an immediate response, any kind of disinformation, but the spreading of disinformation is still high. What is your experience about these cases? As we mentioned before, we have parliamentary elections in October, and your recommendations and opinions is important for us. Thank you. And I have a question about artificial intelligence. Can this AI can operate in Georgia?
So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Sweden is often mentioned as a very good example about preparations, but we might not be the best example of how to tackle disinformation, since we are not the country that has been targeted the most. We have done a lot of work to prepare ourselves, but we don't know for sure that all the preparations that we have done, how would they withstand a big attack on our country. So maybe there are other countries or representatives in here that might be able to give better advice than I can do, because we're still down to our guidelines and trainings and our corporations, and we have not really been tested on in the real world. So I don't know, David, you're nodding here if you want to add something, good recommendations.
No, I was going to piggyback on your point of if we wanted to open this up, if there's anyone else who had something they wanted to perhaps jump in on because they had incurred anything, or if you don't remember, right, but you come up with something you want to touch on that later on, that's okay too.
It's afternoon already. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Katarina Klinkova. I'm a researcher from Slovakia. Few points and then actually a question. While I understand that it's very important to have all these frameworks and discuss, foreign malign influence and put together databases providing insights on FIMI, I think that it's very important to understand that in a lot of the countries, and I'm coming from Central Europe, I'm coming from Slovakia, most of the disinformation are actually spread by domestic actors. Most of the disinformation and polarizing narratives are spread by mainstream political leaders. One of the trends that we've seen over the years is that while back in 2014-15, the disinformation conspiracy theories and actors spreading them were at the edge of the information space, at the edge of the political spectrum, now they're sitting in the government. Now some of them are leading the government. While we are talking here about Russia, China, yes, it's important, but like even within the European Union, the foreign malign influence that we observe is, for example, for many countries coming from Hungary. And it can be coming also closely from other countries as soon. So we need to be active and build resilience, I think, on several fronts in this sense. And in this sense, my question to you would be, do you think that the social media platforms should more actively fact check politicians? Because, I mean, before the elections, we've seen the pattern that Meta revised the social media accounts of Donald Trump in sense of the freedom of speech. But at the same time, we see that the mainstream political representatives, before numerous elections, including the EP elections in various countries, were spreading, false information about the European Union, about migrants, polarizing the societies, about the war in Ukraine. The argument of the social media platforms is that this is within the limit of freedom of speech. Yes, there is a freedom of speech, but then there's a fact that they're spreading blatant lies. So yeah, I would like to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Maybe it's a good question. Maybe I'll start. So that's why actually all this information threat, it's Achilles heel of democratic society. It's because it's really easy to attack and it's really hard to protect. And unfortunately, you can't do anything about that, right? So like it is as it is. Frankly saying, I think I agree with social media platforms and their policymakers, because this is the natural right of the person spread whatever they think is truth. Especially sometimes even, those who are spreading this information from your perspective might be right in 5-10 years. We saw this about, let's say, usage of different medication, right? That 100 years ago was considered as a fine, and then it was considered as a bad. I'm not saying that we need to tolerate this, but I'm just saying that you cannot shut down accounts of people, even they say that Earth is flat, just because they say it. You need to address it from another perspective, from a perspective that, and I don't like it as well, but this is their natural right to behave this way. And this is what is the democracy is about. And it's handled through education, through journalists, through the media. We see the latest debate in the US elections, right? There was a fact-checking, during the process, there was a fact-checking organizations in the UK elections, and they made a great job and were doing kind of the same stuff. So you don't handle this by banning accounts. You handle this by discussions and media literacy. What you handle by banning accounts, it's a bots, amplification, violation of the policy. So if you spread that Earth is flat, it's your right. But if you hire an agency or malign professionals to amplify this and then seed it in the community inauthentically, this is something you need to be punished for. So we need to draw this line, and this is my perspective, and focus on those who violate the policy and amplify it in an unnatural way. So this is becoming not a fair game. So that's kind of something I can share.
Daria, did you have a point that you wanted to jump in on?
Yes, just very briefly in the interest of time, because I think it's a very important point that's raised because we are in an era of democratic backsliding. So we can share this resource later, but IFES actually published 2 papers on this in terms of autocratic collaboration and learning and paths to democratic resilience, thinking about especially in contexts like Hungary and Slovakia and others in the region where you actually have the government or domestic actors responsible for some of these narratives and amplifying them, looking at how we can help different parts of the democratic system withstand those shocks and stresses, and also what the path to recovery looks like, and working with different aspects of the system and society, kind of one piece at a time. So that's a very short plug because it is a very important question.
No, I appreciate both those inputs, and I do appreciate the framing and the reminder that right, well, while we may be focusing in some respects more on the foreign piece of it, and that there may be both legal and political reasons for that, the domestic piece is important, and in many respects, right, in many places, frankly, as big, if not a bigger issue. I want to throw it to Nikki. I think there was Nikki, I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on something that came across.
Thank you, David. Maybe just to echo Daria, when it comes to countries like Hungary and Slovakia that, are currently considering being on a backsliding journey, I think here we just need to wait, especially when the disinformation is coming from the government and, government representatives. We just need to unfortunately wait to another election period. And in the meantime, trying to cooperate with democratic actors, democratic opposition, and trying to debunk, create alliances and learn from each other. So that would be my plug, and yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists here, and thank all for their presentations, and thank all of you for your wonderful questions. We'll now be off to lunch.
So false alarm, we are not ready for lunch yet, but we are at the end of our hybrid portion. So just on behalf of IFES, my amazing team here in Prague, everyone here in the room, I really want to thank all of those joining us online. Thank you so much for bearing with us through all of the technical difficulties as we tried to address both realms here in the room and online to the extent possible. So thank you all very much.